Good afternoon. Welcome to a live stream event sponsored by the National Catholic Reporter. I'm Heidi Schlumpf, NCR's executive editor. On Monday, Pope Francis returned from a 3-day trip to Iraq, where he visited with the beleaguered Christian minority there and also met with Muslim leaders in an effort to improve interreligious dialogue. Our guest today includes someone who was on that trip with the Pope, NCR's own Vatican correspondent, Joshua McElwee. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, nice to be with you.
Good to have you back. And our second guest is Asad Dandia. Asad is an educator, organizer, and graduate student of Islamic Studies at Columbia University. Welcome, Asad.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for hosting me, and a special thanks to the National Catholic Reporter for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you today to discuss this world history.
Great, and we're so glad to have you too. So just a bit of housekeeping for those of you who are following along on YouTube and Facebook. I have several questions for our guests, but we'll also be taking questions from you towards the end of this half hour. So if you have questions for our guests, please type them in the chat area of either Facebook or YouTube, and I will ask some of our guests later. So Josh, I'm going to start with you. This was the Pope's and your first trip outside of Italy in more than a year. How was it to be traveling again with Francis, and what is your overall impression of this trip's significance?
Well, it was really fun. I mean, it was fun to be traveling again. As you mentioned, my wife and I haven't left Italy since 2019 because of the pandemic, and we've been subject to the Rome lockdowns or the Italian lockdowns from time to time. And it was clear Francis himself had felt wanting to get out, wanting to see people, wanting to be with people again. He hadn't traveled since November 2019. And it was good to see him again, see him kind of out with the people, especially on such a historic trip as this, the first Pope going to Iraq, going for such reasons as to, as you mentioned, to encourage the Christian community that was so devastated by ISIS when they controlled parts of the country from 2014 to 2017. And then to have this historic encounter with Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, the first meeting first of its kind meeting between the Pope and Sistani. Obviously, there was a lot of edifying moments, especially for the Christians. I was able to meet several people we were traveling in 6 different cities over 3 days, very intense. I was exhausted. I can imagine the Pope must have been exhausted, 84 years old. It was a bit surreal, though, as well, being held during a pandemic. Basically, it felt like some of the precautions that had been foreseen were thrown out the window. And it leaves me with a lot of questions about why this was planned in the way that it was. I'm seeing an AP report today that there's a historic level of cases being reported today in Iraq, and I really wonder about that.
Yes, well, let's get to that in a moment. But first, I'd like to turn to you, Asad. Josh mentioned this private meeting with the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, in which the Pope thanked the Shia leader for how his community had, quote, raised its voice in defense of the persecuted, unquote. Can you help put some of this in context for us and help us understand what this trip means for Catholic-Muslim dialogue and relations?
That's a wonderful question, Heidi. I think to understand what it means for Catholic-Muslim relations, it's important to have some background on how religious authority functions in the Muslim majority world. Islam does not really have the equivalent of what you would call the clergy or a pope. But what you have are certain religious authorities who've earned the recognition of the wider community, sort of in like a peer review process. And Sistani is unique in this respect as a religious authority because he's revered both by Shia and Sunni Muslims. And that's from the religious side of things. From the political side of things, Sistani is neither a government official nor is he sponsored by any government. He's sort of independent and autonomous in that respect. And so that's particularly why the Pope's meeting with him was met with universal applaud across the global Muslim community. The Pope meeting with Sistani, as opposed to, let's say, another political figure as his first meeting in the country, is not just an affirmation of Sistani, but also an affirmation of the Muslim community as a whole. And that gesture goes a long way. It was certainly noticed all across the Muslim majority world, and I think it it's very symbolic in terms of Catholic-Muslim relations in that respect.
Well, thank you for that background. That's really helpful. Maybe here on the Catholic side, we wish we had peer review for our leaders too. Just a reminder to those of the viewers out there, I see questions are starting to come in. If you have questions for Josh or Assad, please write them in the comments section. Assad, just a follow-up question. So when Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti came out, you wrote a piece for us in NCR saying that the document provided new language for social solidarity. What could that solidarity, especially among people of different religious faiths, look like, do you think?
I was really inspired by the encyclical. For me, it offered a language of social solidarity rooted in the paradigm of friendship. And the way I conceive of this paradigm is that it embraces difference not as an accident or as a deviation, but as part of the divine intention. It reminded me of a verse in the Quran, specifically the 13th verse in chapter 49, which, paraphrased, declares that God made us into different people and tribes so that we may come to know one another. And I saw the Pope's encyclical as an affirmation of this particular verse. We're living in a difficult time right now. It's in my op-ed, I called it the age of pharaohs, where Muslims are under siege in places like India, Myanmar, and China, and centuries-old Christian communities are enduring intense persecution in the Middle East and Asia, of course, including Iraq. And so amidst this trauma, Pope Francis begins his encyclical with a paradigm of friendship, and a paradigm that draws from historic Muslim Catholic encounters to underscore the possibility of human fraternity. And that really stood out to me in particular, because we're at a critical juncture where the possibilities of really inaugurating this kind of friendship are ripe. We are different theologically, nationally, ethnically, and so forth, but it is precisely because of that difference that we are meant to get to know one another and protect one another as witnesses on behalf of God.
Josh, do you want to follow up on that at all? Did you see examples of friendship and solidarity on the trip with the Pope, or do you see any contrast with sort of previous ways or other ways that Muslim Christian missions have been?
I mean, I think widening the lens a bit is quite interesting that the Pope has chosen to visit now 9 Muslim majority countries. And he's also, he's the first Pope to go to Egypt to meet with, partially to meet with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, another Muslim figure in the Sunni tradition. He's been to Morocco. He was the first Pope also to go to the United Arab Emirates, where he held a big interfaith gathering where they signed this document on human fraternity. And so I think we've seen this focus from Francis now on really trying to strengthen Muslim-Christian dialogue. I think we can say it's unique in the history of the papacy. I mean, John Paul II, I think, pursued Muslim-Christian dialogue, but not really to this way. I mean, Francis came to Iraq, and he didn't ask for any sort of preconditions or anything on the meeting with al-Sistani. And the way he characterized it on the plane home in our press conference with him, he described Sistani as a man of God, a wise man, and how basically he said the meeting did good for his soul. And I think these kinds of things in terms of a Christian Pope, a Catholic Pope meeting with a Muslim leader are things we really couldn't have imagined even a few years ago. And I think we're seeing a real focus from Francis, who's named for the saint from Assisi, who also pursued dialogue, of a different kind of papal diplomacy and a different kind of, I think, Catholic leadership.
Assad, did you want to say anything back to that?
Yeah, it's really profound because Pope Francis, as Josh mentioned, has met with the Sheikh al-Azhar in Egypt, and now he's meeting with, or now he has met with Sistani in Iraq. And these two sort of figures, again, while neither of them are the equivalent of a pope, they're both sort of the faces of institutions of Sunni and Shia Islam, respectively. And the Pope being able to recognize that delicate balance and that nuance, it is most certainly noticed in the Muslim majority world. And that thought and consideration is really taken into account when it comes to Catholic and Muslim relations. And I think it's going to trickle down into Muslim communities. And it's quite historic and quite profound to see.
Great. Josh, we have a question coming in with someone specifically asking about how things were on the ground at Karakash. Can you speak to that a little bit as someone who was on the ground in Iraq?
Yeah, so on the final full day of the visit on Sunday, the Pope went to Marrakesh, to Mosul, and to Erbil. Marrakesh and Mosul were two of the places that were overrun by ISIS and controlled by ISIS for about 3 years, and suffered massive persecution and destruction. So in Mosul, we saw the Pope stand in a square where there had been 4 churches, and now there's basically just rubble, sand-colored rubble of the bricks of the churches. And it was a very shocking and kind of stirring moment, the Pope in this square giving a very simple allocution about peace and about the suffering that these people have been through, not just the Christians, but he also highlighted the Yazidi population, which the UN says has suffered a genocide under ISIS. And then he offered a very simple prayer, at the beginning of which he gave a very simple 3-part catechesis about God being a God of love, and if God is a God of love, you cannot hate your brother or your sister. In Marrakesh, I was very lucky to be on the small press pool inside the church where the Pope went. This was the Al Tahira Syriac Catholic Cathedral, which had been burned and desecrated by ISIS, and the local community had come together to rebuild it, essentially in a rush for the Pope. And it was beautifully done with marble columns and white frescoes. I was lucky enough to be seated next to one of the sisters of the Dominican Sisters of St. Catherine of Siena, who have been ministering in that community. And they were talking about what it meant to be with the Pope in that space, that he had come, especially in a time when they're very afraid that many Christians have left, that the community is diminishing, and they're not sure exactly what the future could look like with such diminished numbers.
Thank you. That's very helpful to hear. Assad, well, how do you think that the Pope's message from that Josh is referencing there, how do you think that was heard by Muslims, or at least Muslims in the United States?
You know, as Josh underscored, when Pope Francis visited Mosul and he visited Karakosh, I think the fact that he really embraced and sat with the pain that the people there experienced, you know, sent, you know, the message reverberated, because, you know, there were the Christian communities who were persecuted, but there were also Muslim communities that were persecuted at the same time, right? Millions of people displaced as a result of ISIS's atrocities. Muslims, particularly in Iraq and Syria, have endured enormous pain. And I think to see the Pope there with the religious community of Iraq, Muslim and Christian alike, underscores precisely what was in his encyclical, the fact that this is, you know, we are coming together in a show of solidarity against those who seek to destroy us precisely because of that difference. And so, you know, just from a social standpoint, it sends a strong message, but from a theological standpoint, I think it really embodies the kind of theology that is a directly counter to what everything ISIS stood for, right? It's a counter to what the Pope calls in his encyclical the kind of populism that is overtaking, you know, much of the world. And I think the symbolism of that really reverberated very well with the Muslim community in the US.
Well, thank you for that perspective. We have questions starting to come in, and just a reminder to folks, if they want to ask questions, they can add them to the chat. We have one here for you, Josh, from Jordan Denari Duffner, who's asking if, did the Pope speak much about the US invasion of Iraq and other foreign military involvement there?
Hi to Jordan. She collaborated in our book on a Pope Francis lexicon. The Pope did not refer specifically to the invasion. He referred several times to the years of violence and destruction in Iraq, but there was no direct reference to the US-led invasion or to any of the political situation regarding the 2003 invasion.
Yes, we mentioned that this in our editorial that we ran this morning. The editorial also mentions some concerns that both you have mentioned, Josh, and NCR was concerned about some of the traveling in the middle of a pandemic, some of the lack of social distancing and masking that happened at events there. What are your thoughts about that aspect of the trip, Josh?
I think it was a bit compromised. I think the trip will have to have an asterisk with it, and it's kind of a shame. It's such a historic trip. It's so important that the Pope went. It's so important to send the message of peace and dialogue, and so important for the Christians in Iraq to have that encouragement. But there was a trip that was held that didn't quite follow the norms of the pandemic. I was in two churches, one in Baghdad and one in Karakush, that were crowded with people. Although there was some mask wearing, I don't think you would say it was following the protocols. And I think we're going to wait and see in coming days, if there is a spike in cases. And if there is, that's something very heavy, I think, for Francis and for his papacy. The Pope, on the flight home, we asked him directly about this. He said he basically had really prayed about this decision to decide whether to go to Iraq at this time. He kind of described his own process of discernment in terms of how he makes decisions like this. And he said it comes from within him, that he feels something tell him what to do. And he said, basically, in this trip, he had hoped that the one who had given him this decision or allowed him to make this decision would protect the people. So kind of invoking a bit of divine providence or divine protection. And, if there's anyone in the Catholic Church who has that knowledge of what God is asking or what God wants, it's the Pope. But I do think there is a bit of a concern that some of these events were a bit dangerous, and I'm just hoping that they won't become something that will really mar the trip in the future.
Yes, and I think we need to note, of course, that you and the Pope and everyone who was traveling with the papal trip were vaccinated for the coronavirus before you traveled, but it's your concern for the Iraqi people on the ground who may have been exposing one another or to something. Assad, do you have any concerns? Will that aspect of the trip mar in any way what the importance of how historic it was?
I'm hoping it was a sincere miscalculation and not something that was intentional. And so that's the assumption that I'm operating on. It is my hope that it doesn't mar sort of the perception, at least. But I see it as a lesson, and as Josh said, an asterisk, as something to learn from and to take into consideration, as the Pope continues his journey, if he's traveling anywhere else, because it's important, right? And it's not just from a, just from a social standpoint, but from a theological standpoint as well. The protection of life and human life takes utmost importance. And so, I hope it's a lesson, a constructive one.
Thank you. Josh, speaking of health, how did the Pope look? You said it was a tiring trip even for you, and you're a bit younger than he is. How did he seem?
It was good to see him in person. I hadn't seen him in person for a while because of the pandemic. He's certainly aging. He's 84 years old. He's walking with a very pronounced limp because he has this sciatic pain in his back, which I guess causes a lot of pain. And so on the press conference on the flight home, he admitted that the trip had made him much more tired than the trips in the past had done. In the past, watching him abroad was somewhat amazing. He had an energy that seemed to just appear from nowhere. These long trips in the Pope Mobile, especially in places with big Catholic populations, are very tiring. I mean, you're going miles and miles, and your arm is up the whole time waving, and you can imagine how tiring it is. But the Pope has been quite incredible, and he seems to get an energy from the crowd and from the people. But I think we're going to see a bit of a change in pace, just because of his age, because of the pain. And I'm not sure we're going to see those longer trips again. This might become more of a thing where the Pope is able to travel for 2 or 3 days at a time, and might not be able to do those longer trips more.
So he indicated it in the press conference that he's planning or hopes to plan for that trip to Hungary, and the next place, or at least a place he'd like to go, is Lebanon, correct?
Yeah, the Pope said he had made a promise to the Patriarch in Lebanon, Patriarch Rai, that he would come He told us that the original plan for the Iraq trip had involved like a brief stop in Lebanon, either on the way back or the way there. But the Pope said he felt like that would be like offering crumbs to the Lebanese people, and he wanted to make a full trip. He wasn't sure when that might be possible, just given all the political instability right now in Lebanon. So the only trip we know about for sure is in September, to not really to Hungary, just to Budapest for the International Eucharistic Congress. The Pope said he wanted only to go for the Mass, the Sunday Mass for the Congress. But he said the cardinal in nearby Slovakia had told him, well, Bratislava is only 2 hours drive away. And he told us that that's how these things get started. So we'll see what he decides.
Yeah. So one question that's coming in from a viewer here, or more than one viewer, is asking, certainly there were gatherings of Christians and Muslims, but they're wondering if other faith traditions were represented, specifically involved in this trip.
That was a question when the Pope went to Ur. So he went to Ur on the Saturday for the interreligious gathering. Ur is the ruins of Ur, which in the Bible is the city from which Abraham is said to have come. Abraham being the patriarch of the three monotheistic religions. And the Vatican had said in advance that they expected there might at least be a Jewish delegation of some sort, however small. I guess keeping in mind that there aren't that many Jews left in Iraq. Many have left. Many decided to go to Israel when Israel became a state decades ago. And unfortunately, there were no Jews that we knew of present at that interreligious gathering. We asked the Vatican and also local officials. They just told us there was no one they could find able to come. But I've seen some commentary online that there were several Jews who would have been willing to come. They just weren't asked. And so it left a bit of a wondering in terms of there might have been a local dynamic there that they weren't able to overcome.
Well, Sad, do you have any insights into that? Do you think it would have been even more powerful to have Jewish representatives at that meeting as well?
I think it would have sent a profound statement if representatives of the three Abrahamic traditions were present at the same time. There is a small community of Jews in Iraq. They're a little scattered, but as Josh said, it's a dwindling community. There are still fears with regards to any sort of public engagement. The community sort of as a means of self-protection kind of sticks to itself, and so it can be difficult to arrange that logistically. But it would have most certainly sent a very powerful statement to see representatives of the three traditions present at the same time.
Thank you. Another question from a viewer here. It's from Patricia Crowley. She's wondering if people are continuing to flee from the country at this time. Did Francis speak about the refugees at all on this trip? Josh?
Yeah, Francis spoke about people fleeing the country. He encouraged Christians who had left to come back if they felt able to do so. He did that in Marrakesh when he addressed the community and the church. I'm not recalling the Pope mentioning refugees in particular while in the country, but on the way back in the press conference, we asked him about migration and refugees, and he gave the answer that's kind of become a bit standard for him in terms of he wants countries to welcome refugees, but he has a three-part thing that they should welcome, integrate, and then there's a third part. The main thing is welcoming and integrating. And he often talks about that he wants countries to welcome refugees, but he doesn't want them to stretch beyond what they can do. So he leaves it a bit up to the political leaders to determine what is best for their country. He does raise up examples. One example he often gives is Jordan, which he says has treated refugees quite well.
Asad, did you want to comment on that at all? I was kind of struck by the Pope's comment encouraging people to come back, given that it's not exactly violence-free yet there. So what were your thoughts about those comments?
Yeah, I had the chance to actually travel to Iraq myself in late 2018. I actually went for spiritual pilgrimage myself. And I went to about half a dozen cities. And this was, of course, pre-pandemic. The country is still in the process of reconstruction. The infrastructure is still, obliterated from not just from ISIS in the recent years, but also the Iraq War, the damage of the Iraq War. There has not been any sort of reckoning with that. The country is also facing, aside from this, just like problems with regards to electricity, clean water, housing, etc. And so these are also things that need to be accounted for and reckoned with. And so it's I understand the gesture to call people to return, to come back, but also to ask them to call back when these very basic needs are not met yet, and the reconstruction is still taking place, is a risky call to make, at the very least.
Yeah. Just to follow up, we also have a question asking if you could talk a little bit more about Muslims' experience of the war and violence in Iraq, particularly under ISIS. Do you have any insights into that, given your travels there?
Yeah, Iraq and of course Afghanistan are emblematic of the war on terror and all of the violence that the Muslim community globally has endured for going on 2 decades now. The refugee surge in Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States, I think, speaks to that. The trauma has been enormous on several levels. There really has not been sort of an accounting or reckoning with the perpetrators of the war, and the refugees in many ways have been dehumanized to such an extent that many of them, as we all know, have been left at sea or worse. And that is still felt in the Muslim community, in the Muslim American community, where we have large migrant and refugee populations. Right here in New York, the tri-state area, we have a significant Iraqi and Syrian refugee population. And the trauma of the war is still very real. It's still ongoing. We like to talk about it as if it ended. It doesn't really make the headlines in our news media, but I think those who bear the brunt of the violence are still, they still have not recovered yet. They're still dealing with that.
One final question before I get to the end here. One other person is asking, could more be said regarding the Muslim community in Iran versus Iraq? Different perspective between those two Shiite branches. Assad,
Sure.
is something you could speak to?
Yeah, so the communities in both countries are incredibly diverse. And so, I bracket my answer with the caveat that, one person cannot speak for entire communities. There are competing strands of Shia Islam between the two countries. Ayatollah Ali Sistani, as I had mentioned previously, is not a representative of the government, nor is he sponsored by the government. And so the Pope's visits to him, as opposed to visiting leaders in Iran, sends a powerful statement. And I think, someone in the audience had also asked, how do we continue to nurture relationships between Muslims and Catholics? And I think the Pope struck the right note, because a lot of the leaders in a number of Middle Eastern and Muslim majority countries are unelected. They're not representative of the people's will and aspirations and desires. But Sistani is very different in that respect. He's one of the few leaders, and I can probably count them, on one hand, maybe 2 hands, who are revered on the ground. And I think that makes a significant difference, because it indicates to the Muslim community, to Muslims as a whole who are viewing this, that the Pope understands the struggles of Muslims, struggles for democracy, struggles for rights. And the Pope understands that Sistani has played a profound role in advancing those struggles for 2 decades. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, about I think a decade and a half ago. He's universally revered by Sunni and Shia alike. And so by visiting Iraq as opposed to Iran, and meeting with Sistani as opposed to the leaders of Iran, the Pope indirectly very acknowledges that reality, and the message was delivered, put it that way.
So Josh, I'll let you have the last word here. Do you have any other comments about what kind of follow-up you think might be needed after this trip, both to nurture the Catholic-Muslim relationships or or attend to Christians in Iraq? What do you see as the next steps?
I'm thinking about a CRS official I spoke with named Hassan Amir, who's an Iraqi in the north of the country, I think in Dohuk. And he said that he was hoping the trip would bring spotlight to the country and kind of remind people of the trouble that Iraq is going through, the violence, the need for reconstruction, the need for help, international aid. And I'm not sure that that end has been achieved. I think there was a brief spotlight on the country, and I don't know kind of how long that lasts. I'm a bit curious to see how long, what actually happens in terms of bringing this focus back to Iraq. And then I think we will be following to see if there is a spike in coronavirus cases, and see kind of what that looks like. And I'm wondering too what the next step is for Francis in terms of this Muslim-Christian dialogue. He's now done, these two incredible meetings, or forged these two incredible friendships with the imam and the ayatollah. And I wonder kind of what would be the next step. And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, thank you, Josh. Sounds like there's much to be hopeful about. I want to thank both of you, Asad Dandia and Joshua McElwee, for being our guests today. A special thanks also to our behind-the-scenes folks, to Stephanie Yeagle and Brittany Wilmus, who helped produce this event, to our viewers who are joining us live, and to those who might view this later. If you enjoy these types of events, we would kindly ask that you might consider financially supporting the journalism of the National Catholic Reporter. You can donate or become a member and give us regular support through our membership program, which has some benefits as well. So just a reminder that next week, our Soul Seeing for Lent live event will continue with Benedictine Sister Joan Chittister. That event will be next Wednesday at 1:30 Central, 2:30 Eastern. And as always, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.